You told them the truth. You said how you felt. You were clear. You were open. And they disappeared. Not because you said something wrong. Not because you were too much or not enough. But because the social system you're operating in has been quietly, consistently, rewarding something else entirely. And nobody warned you. Think about your friend group for a second. Who gets the most social currency in that circle? Is it the person who's always available? Always supportive, always texting back, always showing up? Or is it the one who's a little bit unpredictable? The one whose attention feels like something you have to earn? Most people, if they're honest, know the answer, and they hate that they know. Now think about your workplace. The person who says yes to everything, who absorbs stress quietly and never pushes back. How are they treated? Versus the person who knows when to say no, who has visible standards, who doesn't perform enthusiasm they don't feel. And now, dating. The one who texts first, plans everything, makes their feelings obvious, versus the one who keeps a little mystery, who doesn't over-explain, who seems to have a life that doesn't revolve around you. This isn't a coincidence across 3 separate domains of life. This is a pattern, and a man who died in 1900 saw it coming. His name was Friedrich Nietzsche, and he was not, let me be clear, a guru. He wasn't a self-help philosopher. He wasn't writing dating advice. He was doing something far more uncomfortable. He was describing how social power actually moves beneath the surface of civilized behavior. Nietzsche identified something he called slave morality. The idea is simple. When a group of people lacks power, they don't fight for it directly. Instead, they reframe weakness as virtue. They call their compliance kindness. They call their fear humility. They call their need for approval love. And over time, the system starts to reward that framing. Not because it's true, but because it keeps people manageable. It keeps people predictable. It keeps people needing. Nietzsche also described its opposite, the will to power. Not power over other people. That's a misreading most people stop at. Will to power means the drive to become more fully yourself, to stop organizing your behavior around what others will approve of, to stop editing your life for an audience. And from that, he proposed something he called the Übermensch, not a superior human in any racial or physical sense, but a person who has stopped inheriting their values from the crowd and started building them from the inside out. What I want you to understand is that Nietzsche's frameworks, written in the late 1800s, are a nearly perfect diagnostic tool for what's happening in modern dating right now, today. In your phone, in your messages, in the patterns you've noticed but maybe haven't named. Over the next 20 minutes, I'm going to walk you through 7 psychological mechanisms that explain why modern dating punishes honesty and rewards strategic emotional distance. But here's what I need you to understand before we begin. These aren't 7 separate ideas. They're a chain. Each one only makes full sense once you understand the one before it. We'll start with something called the scarcity of self. By the moment you make yourself too emotionally available, you stop being perceived as someone worth pursuing. Then we'll move to the validation trap. Why seeking approval is structurally indistinguishable from revealing a weakness. We'll get into emotional predictability and why it quietly drains the attention of the exact people you're trying to hold. Then we'll go somewhere that makes most people uncomfortable, the dependency signal, and what it costs you the moment someone realizes they have your certainty. And that will set up one of the most counterintuitive things I'll say in this entire video, that honesty, raw, upfront, unstrategic honesty, can actually read as low social value in a system that wasn't designed to reward it. We'll also look at narrative control, who gets to define the dynamic in any relationship, and why the person who shows their hand first almost always loses that definition. And we'll finish somewhere that matters, not with manipulation tactics, but with what Nietzsche would call sovereignty, the ability to engage with social systems clearly, without being consumed by them. Stay with me, because if you drop out early, the later principles won't land the way they should. Principle 1. The scarcity of self. Abundance devalues. even when the thing being given is genuine. You've met someone interesting, you like them, it feels real, and so you do what emotionally honest people do. You show up, you text, you plan, you make time, you make it clear through action and word that you're interested, and then something shifts. Their responses get slower, the energy drops, they're still there technically, but something changed. Nietzsche would say you made yourself too legible. In his framework, value and scarcity are almost the same concept. When something is abundant, freely given, always available, the human brain stops assigning it weight. This isn't cruelty, it's cognitive economy. We unconsciously assign value based on what we have to work for, what we might lose, what exists at a slight remove from us. Availability, when unearned, signals low selectivity, and low selectivity reads as low personal standard. This isn't about playing games. This is about a real perceptual bias that operates largely below conscious awareness. The person pulling away from your enthusiasm isn't doing it deliberately. They're responding to a signal that says, this person needs me to want them. And need, when it's visible, when it's upfront, changes the emotional math entirely. The shift here isn't about becoming cold. It's about becoming genuinely full. When your attention is something you give because you actually want to give it, not because you're managing someone's interest in you, it reads completely differently. The goal is not artificial scarcity. The goal is real investment in your own life. When you have things you care about, your attention naturally carries more weight because it costs something to give. But here's where it gets more complicated, because the moment you understand scarcity of self, you run into a new problem. You start wanting reassurance, you start looking for signs, and that seeking is the trap we'll talk about next. Principle 2, the validation trap. Seeking approval reveals the terms by which you can be controlled. You become more intentional. You're not over-texting, you're not over-explaining, but now you're doing something else. You're watching for signals, watching for responses, checking if the energy is shifted, wondering if they noticed you pulled back, refreshing, waiting, interpreting. Nietzsche called this, in different language, the slave's essential problem. It's not about behavior anymore. It's about orientation. Who are you living toward? Slave morality is always defined in relation to an external authority. I am okay because the signal was positive. I am anxious because they haven't responded. The moment you start seeking validation, even quietly, even invisibly, you've handed your emotional state to someone who didn't ask for it. And people can feel that. The need for external validation is structurally identical to revealing a pressure point. Once visible, it restructures the dynamic. This is why ghosting is so psychologically devastating for people who seek validation. It's not just absence, it's the removal of the only feedback mechanism making them feel stable. The silence doesn't just feel like rejection. It feels like the floor disappearing, because functionally, for someone organized around external approval, that's exactly what's happening. The shift here is about building what psychologists call internal locus of control. It means developing interests, commitments, relationships, and standards that exist entirely independent of any single person's opinion of you, so that when someone goes quiet, your floor stays where it is. But once you've worked on your validation dependency, once your state is more stable, you'll notice something strange. You start becoming more predictable, and predictability, we're about to see, has its own hidden cost. Principle 3, the predictability drain. Certainty removes tension, and tension is what holds attention. Things are going well, you feel secure, they feel secure. The dynamic has settled into something comfortable, and then, almost imperceptibly, the conversations get a little shorter, the effort gets a little lighter. The hunger that was there at the beginning has been quietly replaced by something more like routine. Nietzsche wrote about the will needing resistance, not conflict for its own sake, but the sense that something is still being navigated, still being earned, still unresolved. He observed that humans don't just want what they have, they want to feel the striving towards something. The moment that striving ends, so does a certain kind of vitality. Uncertainty, in measured doses, increases dopaminergic response. The brain pays more attention to what it cannot fully predict. This creates a genuinely uncomfortable situation for people who value consistency, because what predictability communicates, even when it comes from a good place, is that the pursuit is over, that there's nothing left to discover. And resolved uncertainty, neurologically, is a signal to stop paying attention. The answer here isn't to manufacture drama. It's to remain genuinely multidimensional, to keep growing, to keep having a life that is in motion. A person who is genuinely developing, genuinely curious, genuinely in process, is by definition not fully predictable. But once we understand predictability, we run into something darker, because the inverse of predictability is dependency. And dependency, how it forms, what it costs, is where this conversation gets uncomfortable. Principle 4. The dependency signal. The moment someone knows they have your certainty, your value in their calculation shifts. You've said it, maybe not in words, but through action, through consistency, through all the small signals you've communicated. I'm in. You're not going anywhere. And something, subtle but real, changes after that moment. Nietzsche observed that in any relationship, romantic, social, professional, power tends to accumulate with the person who needs the other person less. Not because they're playing games, but because need, visible need, restructures what each person brings to the dynamic. When one person has established certainty, when they've made it clear they are invested regardless, the other person's choices become relatively costless. They can pull back, they can go quiet, they can test the edges, because they already know the conclusion. Commitment certainty, communicated prematurely, removes the perceived cost of disengagement, which paradoxically often triggers disengagement. This is one of the most painful things about genuinely caring about someone. The care itself, if it becomes too visible, too certain, too unilateral, can function as a kind of social liability, not because caring is wrong, but because in a system that responds to perceived value, certainty reads as finality. And finality ends the chase. The practical move here is not to pretend you don't care. That's manipulation, and it doesn't work long term. The move is to ensure your investment in the relationship is matched, paced and mutual, not front-loaded and unilateral. Healthy investment grows alongside reciprocity. All of this sets up a deeper question. Why does honesty, raw, direct, straightforward honesty, get penalized? Because honesty and premature certainty are not the same thing. That distinction is where we're going next. Principle 5. The honesty paradox. Honesty is not the problem. Unstrategic disclosure is. We grow up being told, just be honest. Just say how you feel. If they can't handle who you really are, they're not the right person. And that is genuinely good advice, in a context where both people are emotionally secure. But most early-stage relationships are not that context. They are instead a period of social evaluation, where both people are reading signals, making assessments, and deciding, largely unconsciously, whether this person has high or low relational value. Nietzsche was skeptical of what he called the modern fetish for transparency. He saw this as, often, a kind of weakness dressed up as morality, a preemptive surrender to judgment disguised as courage. Real honesty, in his framework, comes from strength. It's the willingness to say what is true without needing approval for that truth. That's very different from emotional disclosure driven by anxiety, the kind where you reveal your feelings not because it's the right moment, but because the uncertainty has become unbearable. Premature emotional disclosure is often driven by anxiety management, not genuine openness, and reads to the receiver as instability, not honesty. The person who texts at 2 a.m. saying, "I just need to know where this is going," is usually not doing that from a place of elevated self-awareness. They're doing it because the uncertainty became unbearable, and the person receiving that message doesn't primarily experience it as honesty. They experience it as pressure. And pressure in early dynamics almost always triggers retreat. The shift here is learning to distinguish between honesty as a value and urgency as a feeling. Your feelings are valid. The urgency is real. But the moment to share them should be chosen deliberately, not surrendered to compulsively. Honest communication from a stable place at an appropriate moment. That kind of honesty builds trust. Anxiety dumped as honesty does something different. Which leads us to the next question. If how we communicate matters, if timing and framing and stability all play a role, then who is setting the terms of the dynamic? Who's writing the story that both of you are living inside? That's Principle 6. Principle 6. Narrative control. In every relationship, someone is authoring the dynamic. The question is whether it's you. Every relationship has an unspoken story, a set of shared assumptions about what this is, what it means, where it's going, who has more investment, who has more to lose. Most people never consciously author that story. They inherit it. They respond to whoever moved first, whoever established the frame. Nietzsche wrote at length about the power of interpretation. He believed that most of what we call reality is a set of interpretations that some people impose and others accept. The person who defines the terms of a situation has already won a significant portion of it. In dating, this plays out constantly. The person who establishes what this is, casual, serious, committed, exploratory, has authored the foundational story, and the person who accepts that framing, who operates within terms they didn't choose, has handed over something significant. Whoever defines the frame of a relationship sets the emotional labor distribution within it. The undefined party always works harder to resolve ambiguity. This is why ambiguity is such a powerful, if usually unconscious, tool. The person who doesn't define what's happening forces the other person to do the interpretive work, to wonder, to hope, to assume, and all that interpretive labor creates attachment. Not healthy attachment, not the kind built on mutual understanding, but the kind built on projection, on the story you've told yourself about what this might mean. That kind of attachment is fragile, and it's extremely common. The move here is to become someone who authors their own dynamics, not by being controlling or rigid, but by being willing to name what you want, what you see, what you're building. This requires the stability we talked about in Principle 2, because naming your dynamic out loud requires being okay with the possibility that the other person might define it differently. You can only do that from a secure place. And now, finally, we arrive at the 7th principle, the one that underlies everything, because all 6 of these patterns converge into a single question. What does it mean to be a person who doesn't need external systems to tell them who they are? Principle 7. Sovereignty. The goal is not to win the game. It's to become someone who doesn't need to. At some point, if you've been paying attention, you've had this thought, I don't want to play these games. I don't want to manage my availability. I don't want to calibrate my honesty. I just want something real. That frustration is legitimate, and I want to take it seriously, because dismissing it by saying that's just how dating works is intellectually dishonest. Nietzsche's Übermensch was not someone who mastered the game. It was someone who built a life around values they had genuinely chosen, not inherited from social systems, not constructed for approval, but arrived at through honest self-examination. That person still moves through social systems. They still interact with the patterns we've described today, but they do so with clarity, understanding what's happening, choosing consciously how to respond, rather than reacting from anxiety or compulsion. Genuine psychological sovereignty, the capacity to engage with social systems without being defined by them, is the only stable foundation for authentic relationship. Most people never get there, not because they're weak, but because the systems around them are constantly reinforcing the alternative. Approval seeking is rewarded in childhood. Compliance is rewarded in education. Performance is rewarded in social media. And then we're surprised that people arrive at adulthood organized almost entirely around external feedback. This isn't a character flaw. It's a structural outcome. But it remains yours to examine and, if you choose, to dismantle. Sovereignty doesn't mean emotional detachment. It doesn't mean becoming unavailable. cold or strategic. It means building a self that is substantive enough, interested enough, purposeful enough, stable enough that your engagement in relationships comes from fullness, not from need. The person who brings a full life to a relationship is not playing games. They're bringing something real. And real things, it turns out, are what the system is actually looking for, even if the system's surface-level incentives often obscure that fact. Let me bring this back to where we started. You told someone the truth. You showed up. You were clear. And it didn't work the way it was supposed to. Here's what I think that experience actually was. Not evidence that you're broken. Not evidence that honesty is overrated. Not evidence that you should become someone who plays games. It was evidence that you encountered a social system operating on incentives you hadn't yet mapped. The emotional journey most people go through. Confusion, then self-doubt, then realization, then frustration, then a period of cold distance from their own feelings. That journey is understandable. Every stage of it makes psychological sense, but the risk, the thing I want to name clearly, is that some people get stuck in the detachment phase. They learn the game well enough to stop getting hurt by it, and they call that growth. Nietzsche would not call it growth. He would call it a different kind of slave morality, organized not around approval, but around its inverse, proving you don't need anything, performing invulnerability as a defense mechanism, treating emotional distance as though it was strength, real strength, the kind Nietzsche was pointing at, the kind that actually holds up over time, is the capacity to remain open, to remain curious, to be capable of genuine connection without making your stability contingent on it. That is not easy. It is probably the most difficult psychological work a person can do, but it is the work. And if you find yourself back at approval seeking, back to over-texting, over-explaining, over-performing, don't shame yourself for it, but do notice it, because the noticing is where it begins. The system rewards manipulation because the system is, in many ways, made of people who are scared of being too much, scared of being not enough, scared of want being visible. You can understand that system clearly without becoming cynical about it. You can operate within it strategically without becoming someone you don't recognize. And over time, by building real things, by developing real stability, by choosing values that are yours and not borrowed, you become harder to manipulate, not because you've closed off, but because you're no longer organized around what the system offers as a reward. That's Nietzsche's actual point. Not dominance, not cold power, not detachment, authorship, the ability to write your own story inside a world that will try constantly to write it for you. I want to ask you something before you go. Think of a moment, recent or not so recent, where you showed up honestly in a relationship and it didn't land the way you hoped. Drop it in the comments, not the details, not the story. Just what did you do differently after that? Because that's the data. That's where we actually learn something. If this kind of analysis is useful to you, if you want more Nietzsche applied to real human dynamics, not academic philosophy, not abstract theory, subscribe, because we're going to go deeper. And if you're interested in extended conversations on this, the uncut analysis, the more nuanced material, the stuff that doesn't fit neatly into a 20-minute frame, that's behind the join button. Not because it's secret, but because that kind of conversation requires a different kind of room. Stay honest, stay building, and don't let the system flatten you.